Scholz is starting to lose his composure. If the German government once believed that all pressure should be focused on Russia, recent events, like the attack in Kursk, have changed that narrative. Now, demands are being placed on Ukraine as well. It's no coincidence that German investigators have reignited discussions about the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. Since early September, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has shifted gears, re-engaging in diplomacy by advocating peace in Ukraine and urging dialogue with Russia. This move comes as a surprise to many, given that Scholz has been one of the staunchest hawks in the fight against Russia. Except for the Taurus missiles, which Germany has been reluctant to supply due to fears of provoking a larger conflict, Berlin has generously armed Ukraine. From advanced Iris air defense systems to Leopard tanks, Germany has provided substantial military aid. In fact, Germany has outpaced both the UK and France in terms of financial and military support to Kyiv, though London remains the most vocal supporter of Ukrainian escalation. And French President Emmanuel Macron recently even floated the idea of sending NATO troops to the front lines. Scholz has been a steadfast supporter of Ukraine, even in moments when the Western coalition began realizing the grim reality. Ukraine's counter-offensive was faltering. Russia was regaining the upper hand, and both the US Congress and European governments were hesitating to approve more funds or send additional weapons. In these moments of doubt, Scholz remained resolute. It's true that in May, Scholz acknowledged that Germany had reached the limits of its capability. Nonetheless, Germany's total aid to Ukraine has amounted to a staggering 28 billion euros, with another 7 billion euros allocated for 2024, though not all of that has been deployed yet. And despite these strains, Scholz has promised that Berlin will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Throughout 2024, numerous countries, Switzerland, Denmark, China, India, Brazil, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, offered peace plans in an effort to resolve the war in Ukraine. While this diplomatic activity gained momentum, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz remained notably silent on making any grand declarations about peace. Although he didn't reject the goal of ending the war, unlike the global majority nations, Scholz showed no inclination to appease Russia. There were no suggestions of territorial compromises as proposed by figures like Trump, Musk, or even Pope Francis, nor did he make any overtures to invite Russia to negotiations or re-establish dialogue with the Kremlin. Scholz spoke directly with President Putin only once during the winter, and even then it was under pressure, not because of any shift in strategy, but to avoid appearing too hawkish in the eyes of his domestic audience. In his other public appearances, Scholz projected an image of unwavering resolve. During a meeting with US President Joe Biden, Scholz even took a swipe at Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson, emphasizing that Germany remained steadfast in its commitment to NATO's cause. This seemed like a deliberate move to reaffirm Germany's leadership in the alliance and its firm stance against Russia. Upon returning from Washington, he attended the Munich Security Conference, where he doubled down on his position, declaring Russia a direct threat to NATO. At the conference, Scholz reminded everyone of Germany's 100 billion euros investment to bolster the Bundeswehr and assured attendees that Germany's contribution to the defense of NATO would be front and center at the July summit. To solidify his position as a defender of NATO, Scholz took further steps by initiating the deployment of 5,000 German soldiers to Lithuania in the spring. Yet, when it came to the topic of peace in Ukraine, Scholz remained rigid. His condition for negotiations was unequivocal. Discussions could only begin after Russia had fully withdrawn its troops from Ukrainian territory. Then unexpectedly came a dramatic shift. In the early days of autumn, Scholz and his team made a series of surprising statements signaling a readiness for peace. On September 8th, during an interview with ZDF, Scholz announced, "The time has come for discussions on how to accelerate the end of the military conflict in Ukraine." He also reiterated Germany's commitment to ensuring full transparency around the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage and promised to hold those responsible accountable. This shift was followed the next day by a statement from government spokesperson Stefan Hebestreit, who confirmed that Scholz was open to speaking with Vladimir Putin should the moment arise. Heberstreit's words carried even more weight as he noted that there is a sense everywhere in the world that the conflict in Ukraine must end as soon as possible. But perhaps the most striking element of Heberstreit's statement was his emphasis on the nature of the negotiations. He indicated that the talks should primarily take place between Kyiv and Moscow, with Germany playing only a supporting role, an unexpected admission from a country that had previously been at the forefront of Ukraine's support. This change in tone marks a pivotal moment, suggesting that even staunch supporters of Ukraine like Scholz are recognizing the growing necessity of diplomacy over continued military escalation. 2 days later, Chancellor Olaf Scholz made an even stronger case for diplomacy, asserting that a peace conference on Ukraine is essential, with Russia's direct involvement. And I'll say it again. Now is the moment, now is the time when we need to explore what possibilities exist. We need another peace conference, and Russia must be at the negotiating table, Scholz declared in the Bundestag. To ensure his message wasn't misinterpreted, he quickly added that any peace must respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and must not come from capitulation or imposition. This marked a noticeable shift in tone. After months of robust arms deliveries to Ukraine, a hardened stance against Russia, and a refusal to entertain the idea of negotiations, Scholz's recent remarks break from his previous rhetoric. However, these changes begin to make sense when viewed through the lens of political pragmatism. Firstly, Scholz's recent diplomatic overtures are as much about domestic policy as they are about international strategy. Germany's economic woes, rising inflation, falling production, and energy crises tied to sanctions on Russian gas are taking their toll on public sentiment. The burden of funding military support for Ukraine, the Bundeswehr, and NATO allies has amplified German public anxiety. Voters are also keenly aware of the rising risks of a nuclear escalation or Germany's deeper involvement in a broader conflict. These growing fears played out in the electoral losses faced by Scholz's Social Democrats and their partners in the traffic light coalition during the Saxony and Thuringia state elections, where opposition parties such as the far-right Alternative for Germany, AfD, and the leftist Sura Wagenknecht alliance gained ground. Secondly, the fear of open confrontation with Russia looms large, not only among ordinary Germans, but also within the government. Scholz has consistently emphasized, "We are not at war with Russia," a point driven home by his government forcing Annalena Baerbock, the Green Party's foreign minister, to walk back her incendiary comments in 2023 that Germany was at war with Moscow. While Germany is preparing for potential conflict, its intelligence services have issued warnings about possible future Russian invasions of the Baltics and Poland. Scholz is wary of creating an unnecessary pretext for a direct clash. Recent events, including a raid by Ukrainian forces into Russia's Kursk region and NATO's discussions of allowing Kyiv to launch long-range strikes on Russian territory, heighten the risk of further escalation. A third factor driving Scholz's recent diplomatic shift may be the looming US presidential election in November. With Joe Biden sidelined, the Democratic Party's chances seem to have improved, particularly after Kamala Harris's strong performance in the recent debates, where she almost outshined Donald Trump. However, the specter of Trump's return remains real, as the Biden administration continues to face significant challenges both at home and abroad, from the war in Ukraine to the crisis in Gaza. At the Munich Security Conference, Scholz stated that Europe must plan for its own security, regardless of the outcome in Washington. Even a Harris victory would not absolve Germany of the threats tied to the ongoing war in Ukraine. Scholz does not want to see a peace that leaves Ukraine decimated by Russian forces. He insists that peace must be just, not imposed or achieved through capitulation. But if the choice becomes nuclear war or a flawed peace, he would undoubtedly choose the latter. As tensions rise and the US hesitates to fully authorize strikes deep within Russian territory, Scholz is working to steer the West and the global community toward diplomacy before the situation spirals out of control. Germany itself is not well positioned as a mediator. In April, Scholz, along with other European leaders, appealed to Chinese President Xi Jinping to avoid aiding Russia and to pressure Moscow into peace talks. That attempt fell flat. Now, Scholz is advocating for Russia's inclusion in negotiations, recognizing that several nations might serve as viable intermediaries. In his September address to the Bundestag, he noted Berlin's efforts to promote peace conferences in Denmark, Saudi Arabia, Malta, and Switzerland. Currently, the European Union is considering another conference after the Swiss-hosted talks were deemed ineffective. Italy's Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani has voiced support for Saudi Arabia as the next host. Scholz's stance has also evolved in light of recent events. The German government, once singularly focused on applying pressure to Russia, has begun to pressure Ukraine as well. The Kursk incident in particular has shifted the dynamics, and it's no coincidence that German investigators have re-examined the Nord Stream sabotage case at this time. The German prosecutor's office has even issued an arrest warrant for Ukrainian national Volodymyr Zhuravlev. It is in this context that Scholz, during his revealing ZDF interview, promised that the German authorities will do everything to ensure that nothing is concealed in the Nord Stream sabotage case and that those responsible are punished. Ultimately, Scholz appears to be putting great hope in the upcoming peace conference wherever it takes place, believing it could be the moment when Ukrainian and Russian representatives finally meet face to face for the first time since the failed talks in Istanbul. He sees this as a crucial opportunity to shift the trajectory of the conflict, hoping that his push for diplomacy will resonate on the global stage and lead to a resolution that spares Germany and the world further devastation.